Welcome to AVANT Technology Insights. I'm your host, Ken Presti, Research Vice President of AVANT Research and Analytics. The link between solving business challenges and cutting-edge technologies has become tighter and more complex than ever before. In this podcast series, we delve into how enterprise decision makers can leverage SD-WAN, IT security, unified communications as a service, and a host of other SaaS opportunities towards greater operational efficiencies and higher success. We bring you the foremost experts in their respective fields to help you understand and assess the opportunities at hand. So please buckle up and let's begin. My guest today has been active in security and networking for 20 years, going back to his days at Purdue University. He's an information technology strategist and futurist, focusing on IT security, cyber warfare, advanced persistent threats, artificial intelligence, software-defined networking, blockchain, digital disruption, and more. He's a technical business leader who's highly skilled at reducing costs, improving efficiency, and driving profitable revenue opportunities. Currently serving as the Vice President of Technology at Masergy, a privately held technology firm that focuses on cloud enablement, real-time metrics, unified communications as a service, and security as a service. When you're on Twitter, you know him as Ray Redacted. I know him as my pal and my guest here today. I want to welcome Ray Watson. So, Ray, we hear every day about all these different attacks and exploits going on out there. What are you seeing in dealing with these? How do you see them evolving? What's getting worse? What's getting better?
If you think about it, the attacks themselves are getting worse in three different ways. They're getting more severe, they're getting more complex, and they're getting more common, right? So the sheer volume of them has gone up so much, even in the last year or so. As well as the severity and things like that. So today, if you look at cyber defenses, in many ways, it is absolutely an attacker's playfield because so far the advantage is currently placed on the attackers because they only have to be right one time. And to defend a corporate network or to defend a service provider network, you have to be right all the time. And so that's certainly kind of changing the equation, so to speak. We're also facing threats from a lot of different directions. It's no longer, the stereotypical hacker in a hoodie, so to speak, that's trying to penetrate a network. It's also script kiddies, unsophisticated attackers, cyber gangs, insider threats, competitors, ransomware as a service, hacking as a service, all the way up to nation states. And folks that are trying to defend their corporate networks are trying to do all of these things at once. And in many cases, they're trying to do all of these things with a wide variety of tools.
Right. So you look at like the cyber kiddies, and a lot of this stuff is coming from almost like hacking as a service type of thing. A lot of this, I guess, is available on the dark web. How do you see this unfolding, and how does that work in terms of the threat and what they're trying to do in terms of monetizing this?
Well, sure. So, it used to be like even 5 years ago, if somebody wanted to launch a relatively sophisticated attack on a corporate network, they had to be relatively sophisticated themselves. But with the growth of things like toolkits and ransomware as a service, an extremely unsophisticated attacker can now purchase pretty much off the shelf some targeted exploits that are designed to either be ransomware or to penetrate networks that are out there. And someone who doesn't know very much about computers at all can actually do significant damage. And when you pair that with the fact that the risk-reward ratio for cybercrime is very unfairly balanced in the sense that the rewards are extremely high and the risk of being caught is extremely low, especially in countries that don't extradite to the United States. So that's what's kind of causing a lot of the growth in these attacks because an unsophisticated, basically a criminal, can build a ransomware as a service toolkit, launch a phishing attack, and generally they will be successful, at least once on one of those attempts. And so it's changing the game, so to speak, because most corporations number one threat right now is ransomware, and the number one way that that's delivered is via phishing. Right, about 91% of cyber attacks last year started with someone clicking something in an email. It's been a threat vector that's been around for almost 30 years now, and it's still extremely effective as a way to get inside networks and past firewalls.
Yeah, it's interesting because, there's always been crime and thieves in the world, but it seems like the level of vulnerability these days is just different in the cyber world. And it can be really intimidating to try to figure out how to keep your assets protected, especially, given the fact that, this can all cost you a lot of money. This can cost you your reputation. This can actually cost you your liberty in some cases. So, what do you think is the key to in this kind of an environment? You were talking about some of the different types of attacks and different types of vectors that are going on out there. What do you think is the key to protecting yourself in this kind of a situation?
Well, sure. So, I will tell you from a corporate protection standpoint, our thoughts and the kind of the general consensus in the cybersecurity community have evolved quite a bit. Like 3 years ago, or maybe 5 years ago, we would be talking a lot about defense in depth or perimeter based security, or rule sets for looking for certain types of malware. But these days, most cybersecurity professionals are now talking about concepts such as zero trust, right? So instead of thinking that we're going to be able to defend all attacks, period, it's really more about reducing what's called dwell time, which is how long the bad guys are inside, and also segmentation, which is really about if somebody does penetrate your network, making sure that they can only get to certain assets and not, the entire corporate duels, so to speak. And so that's changing a little bit, right? And today, what most people are talking about now is really managed detection and response. So capturing and seeing when an attacker penetrates, and then immediately acting to minimize that damage. And I would give you the analogy of 5 years ago when we talked about defenses. The analogy was always like the castle. You think about a really high wall and maybe a moat, right? And you try to keep them out from ever getting in the castle. But these days, we're actually assuming that they're already inside the castle, and you really want to isolate that. And if you think about in terms of your own home ownership, we're no longer trying to protect your home from a burglar with a crowbar from smashing a window and crawling in. We're now protecting your home from termites, right? And so that means detecting them very, very quickly. It means minimizing the types of things that might draw them in, and ultimately, that really means about eliminating them once you actually do find them.
Okay, so this also has so you've got a couple of different things going on here on in terms of both defense and depth, and I guess a certain amount of defense and breadth, because you've got what's happening on the premises, you've got what's happening in the cloud. This kind of leads to your zero trust scenario, where you would work with the assumption that it's all compromised and that there's really nothing you can do except authentication, I guess, right?
For sure. That's one particular part of it, is knowing how to do authentication around users, around groups, and around roles. That's a very, very important one. Using AI and machine learning to watch for anomalous behaviors, very similar to the way that your credit card company kind of catches whenever there's a really weird charge, on your card, and it suddenly thinks that this might be fraudulent and asks you to verify that, et cetera. And then also not trusting devices or machines, right? Just assuming that if somebody has an Android device that they took home and let their kids play video games on it, that it may very well be bringing malware back into the office when it comes back in. Those are all kind of elements of sort of the modern thoughts around cyber defenses.
So there's literally millions more gigs available out there than there are people to fill those gigs. Um, what do you see happening there as relates to trusted advisors? And then, the other thing that occurred to me on that is you were talking about there's all this technology out there that companies are not using well because of the talent shortage. How do given the fact that they can bring in these trusted advisors, why are they still unable to leverage the technologies that they have?
Yeah, so that's those are two great questions. First and foremost, the talent shortage really comes down to this. It's about 3 million unfilled jobs in cybersecurity today. The hottest job in the United States right now is a data scientist. The second hottest is a SOC analyst one, which is an entry level position in a security operations center. Literally, people cannot be hired quick enough out of college. Unemployment is extremely low, if not negative, in that field, and it's also very difficult to retain people in those roles too, because they're constantly getting job offers from other folks as well. So as a trusted advisor, it's really important to understand that when you're talking to your prospects or to your customers, they are typically facing this labor shortage. That's usually a pain point for them. Is they might have a staff of 3, and they really need a staff of like 10, but they cannot hire it, and they cannot seem to get it. And so, partnering with a managed security services provider basically can act like a force multiplier for that small staff, bringing them the tools and the security operations centers and the software and the hardware to kind of integrate a lot of those services. Can be the big difference for that standpoint, for that piece. Now, when we typically talk about the trusted advisors, it's not usually an HR discussion, right? It's typically a discussion about saving money or bringing agility, or perhaps giving them, the ability to better handle mergers and acquisitions. But in the security realm, it is mostly about a human shortage. That's really ultimately what it comes down to. I think that's important to know as a trusted advisor that's there. Now, when I mentioned the fact that there's a lot of software tools that are understaffed, I mean, that ultimately comes down to the fact that many companies will go out and purchase a particular type of service or a particular box. For example, let's say they went out and got FireEye and Checkpoint, right? And then staffing around supporting those is typically higher than they thought it would be, especially trying to staff it around 24/7. Even log management. Most companies are logging, but they're not checking their logs. They're not using that intelligence, as well as they could be. And so ultimately, having somebody come in and basically offer them the ability to have an overlay SOC, a SOC as a service, so to speak, or I guess in our case it would be SOCs plural, as a service, really brings a lot of value to that, because it allows them to use that existing CapEx and OpEx they already have in the ground, but better to be able to better use it and basically be that force multiplier on the security side.
Okay, so what do you see as the types of attacks that are really the most pervasive and most dangerous, the hardest to get out from under?
Yeah, well, sure. So ransomware seems to be the number one issue for mid-size and large-size businesses today. And in the year 2019, we began seeing some ransomware attacks that included encryption of the backup tapes as well on a storage area network, or if it's on the LAN side as well. And that seems to be a particularly pervasive problem because it's successful, right? Anytime there's a type of attack that pays off and it works, you can expect to see more and more of that. And it has been, overall quite successful, and we can continue to see more and more of that. Now, the anatomy of how that actually happens, though, is you don't just wake up one day and suddenly have ransomware. It typically involves, a multi-stage attack life cycle, so to speak. In many cases, that would start with as simple as a Microsoft Office file that has an embedded macro that then loads a web page that then loads a dropper, and then the dropper actually begins to reach out to command and control servers, and eventually starts the process of infecting the LAN using an exploit like Eternal Blue or one of those types of services that are out there. If you can capture it at any one of those 1, 2, or 3 phases, the first, second, or third step, you can prevent a ton of the damage that actually happens there. And unfortunately, most companies do not. Most companies do not capture it until it's absolutely started to encrypt corporate resources and the ransom has been demanded. These days, that ransom has a time on it. So it'll say things like, pay me 2 Bitcoins now, or pay me 3 Bitcoins in 4 hours, or pay me 5 Bitcoins in 24 hours, right? So it puts a sense of urgency on the user to act very, very, very quickly, rather than be able to, to make some rational decisions around that. And what happens next is most companies have to make a decision. Do we pay this and basically get back to our lives, so to speak, or do we not and try to restore from tape back up? And, again, 2 years ago, we would have said, don't ever pay that. But these days, that equation is changing as well, because there's been situations where people have actually, endangered life, endangered the potential for loss of life or things like that. So when this actually happens to companies, we're talking about significant financial damage, not just because of the payment of ransom, but also to make sure that you've gotten it eliminated, right? In many cases, the programs that they send you to decrypt the files itself is backdoored so that they can continue to have persistence on the network. And then ultimately you're going to have a bigger problem, out there. So that's probably the number one bane of existence is the ingress point or the threat vector is typically phishing, and then ultimately it's going to lead to some type of ransomware. But we've also seen things like extortion as a service, certainly the theft of PII. With the growth of GDPR, we've even seen certain GDPR extortion based. Like, for example, I've got this particular data, and if you don't pay me, I'm going to divulge it to the world. I mean, all of the types of things that were typically unsophisticated criminal activity has now got a twist to it because it's being done over the internet remotely.
Okay, so your answer kind of took me by surprise a little bit a moment ago, because I remember, we had talked about this before, and you said if you pay them, then the dark web knows that you pay, and now all of a sudden all the cats are coming to the yard. But it sounds like that's evolved a little bit. Now I guess you're looking at what the risk is to human life and things of that nature. Can you clarify that a bit?
Yeah, for sure. So, absolutely. If you pay that ransomware, you are 100% tagged as the type of person that will pay, right? As a matter of fact, that's why certain vertical markets, like the healthcare vertical market, has been just ravished by ransomware attacks, is because they have a reputation for paying, right? They have a reputation for paying very quietly and making it go away. But more recently, we've seen municipal governments, like, for example, I think there's 181 municipal governments in Texas that were attacked a few weeks ago across the board. Now, if you're a municipal government and you've got a police department and 911 services that are there, it's not quite as easy of a decision as to say, hey, if we pay this, all the cats are going to come to the yard, or however you just explained that. I like that though, because ultimately, the equation changes a little bit different. I mean, the real answer, Ken, is people need to be having these discussions and having these plans way before ransomware hits, right? That needs to be a corporate decision that people think about, just like you think about fire prevention or any other type of safety issue. Not only how do we prevent it, not only where do we put the fire detectors and the extinguishers, but also what do we do if there's an actual fire? How do we involve the fire department? Things like how do we evacuate the building? All of those types of conversations need to happen around ransomware too. And I think in the case of municipal governments, many of which didn't have backups at all, many of them just ultimately decided that they would just go ahead and pay it because they really didn't have another choice, right? And believe it or not, there's even companies out there that will negotiate your ransom down for you. They'll come in and they'll say, we know this criminal gang, and we've gotten them down. We can get them to reduce their ransom by 50% or whatever. But I would be very cautious about hiring one of those companies, because you always wonder if they're somehow affiliated with the attackers.
Right.
So there's always a big question. You always have to be careful who you hire as a negotiator for the ransom if you're not sure if they might be on the inside.
Okay, so if you're a municipal government, you got 911 and all that, or if you're healthcare and you've got patients involved, go ahead and pay. But if you're basically anybody else, your basic company where, if you lock up my data, you're going to hurt me, but nobody's really going to die from it. Is the guidance still to back up from DRAS or something like that?
Well, it depends on how current your backups are. Now, think about this. If you're a retailer and you have daily full backups, right? You have grandfather, father, son type backups, but the dailies are the ones that really matter. On Black Friday, that equation is way different than on Tuesday, the 11th of February, right? Because if you can't necessarily lose a whole day's worth of productivity, that's one particular issue. So in many cases, and by the way, I will also tell you that one of the things that most people don't realize that you should do whenever there's a ransomware attack is involve law enforcement. The vast majority of people never even bother calling the FBI, even though the FBI might have your keys. They might be able to decrypt it for you. In many cases, they've either reverse engineered, or there've been other companies that have reverse engineered that. And so ultimately, the first thing you need to do is involve law enforcement 100%. But the decision about whether or not to pay or whether or not to restore from backups ultimately comes down to just like any other business decision. Is it worth rolling back? What are we going to lose? Are we sure that the backups aren't going to become infected as well once we restore them? There's and things like that. And by the way, cybersecurity insurance companies in many cases will tell you just pay it, right? Because cybersecurity companies know it will cost 10,000 to pay the ransom, but 500,000 to recover from the ransom is what we saw recently in Baltimore, for example. But that may or may not be the decision either. Ultimately, it really comes down to the business and understanding it. I mean, it really truly is, if you think about it, a nightmare scenario for most businesses, especially public ones, because you've got all this scrutiny on you. There's all this politics involved inside the company, and it's ultimately way better to prevent it from happening in the first place.
Right. But you also mentioned that, that even if you pay them, they still might leave a back door. They still might be able to come at you again. So how, I mean, that's got to complicate matters still further because, okay, if I pay you once, how do I know you're not going to be back in 6 months or 6 days for that matter?
For sure. For sure. And in most cases, they will be back, right? In many cases, they will never have left. In many cases, they will wait until you're completely restored and it looks like you're back to normalcy. And then they're going to hit you once again with the exact same, method and everything else. And so that is a big decision. And ultimately, that is kind of the bane of corporate existence right now on the internet side. And it's not one that's easily solved either. Again, until we can get people to stop, until we can make humans not human anymore, which let me know when that works out. Ultimately we're going to continue to have to deal with phishing and a lot of these other types of issues.
Okay, let's move over to the cloud for a moment. We like to think of the cloud as being pretty secure. I've got some people who are telling me that, you have to go in there and change stuff in order to make it less secure. I've got other people saying that it's, you've got to go in and make changes because, like, for example, if your storage platform has a switch out of place, you could have a serious problem on your hands. Where do you land on that debate?
It comes down to this. The cloud security issues really come down to the fact that in many cases, a lot of companies have moved data to the cloud without necessarily going through the IT or the infosec departments, right? So marketing decides that they want to launch some kind of an initiative. They spin up an AWS instance. They start populating it with customer data just to prove that it actually works. And they didn't know anything about securing buckets or about default credentials or about web application firewalls or any of those kind of things, right? So there's the problem of novices that are actually configuring these. That's sort of the shadow IT problem. There's the other problem that when you move workloads to the cloud, there are new and different types of attacks, such as the ones we just saw with Capital One, where it was as simple as a web application firewall being left in what appears to be a default state from being compiled, right? And that's a different type of an attack than most people would face with hardware appliances or their own types of servers. And then there's also the fact that it's just so much easier and faster to do. So in an environment when it takes 3 or 4 weeks to get a server built, configured, firewall rules, and everything else set up, we're now talking about it taking seconds to do that in AWS, right? And so the barrier for entry is much, much smaller. Now, ultimately, it has gotten a lot better in the last couple of years. Amazon has, as you mentioned, changed some of the default loads that are set up a certain way so that it isn't nearly as bad as it was a while back. But there certainly are new implications to think about when you move workloads from behind the firewall in your own data center out to a public IP address that's basically accessible from anybody, right? And so it's still worth it. The trade-off is still worth it because there's immense benefits to moving those workloads to the cloud, but it is something that people need to keep in mind. And the security posture can be quite different than what you're used to if you're used to deploying everything in your own data centers.
Okay, so when you look at this whole mess, when you look at the different attack vectors and you look at, the issues around the cloud, you look at what's going on with ransomware and you just tie all this stuff together and you look at it from the bad guy's point of view. What is all this worth when you look at cybercrime as a whole from all of these things we've been talking about through this whole interview? What do you think it's worth?
Yeah, so well, according to the FBI, it's about $6 trillion a year. So
Six
that's
trillion
the
dollars.
actual that's the actual dollar figure, around an industry that is trying to protect itself for about 150 billion, right? So you can think about the difference between attackers and defense. Just economically, it's immensely in favor, of the attackers. Also that's growing. It's going to continue to grow at a very, very rapid rate, over time. And we can continue. We can expect to see the attackers get better and better, smarter and smarter. Now, the good news is because of AI, we're going to have an advantage for the next 3 or 4 years before the bad guys starting using AI as well, right? Because of artificial intelligence and machine learning and a lot of these technologies, there will be a certain advantage to the defense companies that know exactly what they're doing and know how to deploy these technologies until eventually the bad guys start using them too. And once you can start to get that off the shelves, it'll literally be robots versus robots.
Wow. Okay. Robots versus robots. That's off the hook. So, okay, for those of us who are not already laying in the fetal position after listening to the things you told us here today, what kind of advice do you have? You mentioned we can leverage AI for at least a few years. This is always going to be a moving target. Is there a kind of macro strategy or any words to the wise that you can offer about how to protect yourself and adapt to things over the long haul?
Yeah, so for sure. So one of the most important things to understand is that corporate security begins with personal security. And there are certain things that you can do that most people know that they should do, but they just aren't doing them necessarily. And that really comes down to the metaphor of hygiene. Like if you think about dental hygiene, for example, Ken, when we think about taking care of our teeth, it's not just brushing your teeth, right? You also have to floss. You have to stay away from sugary foods. You have to go see the dentist every now and then, ultimately to have good, healthy dental hygiene. And in the computer world, that means patch hygiene, means keeping your computers patched. So when the machine pops up and says, I've been warning you about this critical update, you can't keep ignoring those. Keeping your OS up to date. One of the biggest ones around cyber hygiene is not reusing passwords. About 29% of Americans admit that they're reusing passwords across websites today, and I would bet that if we put them to a lie detector test, that number is probably closer to 50. But 20% of the people are lying, right? And that's one of the worst practices that you can do, because when a massive data breach happens, like a LinkedIn or a Yahoo, those passwords become public domain, and they become used in something called credential stuffing, which is when people just basically try every password you've ever used in the past, looking for a match. But one of the biggest things you can do is actually implementing a password manager yourself, so that you don't have to try to remember 50, 60 different passwords. That's the type of software that will actually manage that for you. And then ultimately implementing multi-factor authentication. And on a personal basis, that means setting up your bank accounts, your Gmail, your personal accounts, such that you have to, if you're logged in from an unknown machine, you have to prove that it's you via, a second factor, which is typically either a token or a code sent to your phone or an SMS message. That multi-factor will eliminate a lot of the risk that's out there. But even as corporations, to implement multi-factor really makes a significant difference, across the board when it comes to things like phishing attacks. Because with a phishing attack, even if somebody does get your login and password, they're still not going to be able to use it unless they get that second factor. And there are some extremely sophisticated attacks that get around certain types of multi-factor, but 99.99% of the attackers aren't going to bother, right? It's the old analogy about, you just want you just want that burglar to go to the next door neighbor's house instead of yours, right? And multi-factor can be one of those things that really shields yourself from a lot of those types of services. So, my takeaway advice would be, when you think about corporate protection, think about personal protection first and foremost, and then ultimately really bring in the experts, which you can do via the trusted advisors and the AVANT ecosystem to better address the customer's needs.
Awesome. Great advice. Ray Watson from Masergy. It's always great chatting about this with you. And I have to admit, I'm always a little ill at ease at the end of our conversations because I just learned a whole lot. And but it's a good ill at ease if it helps me to do things the right way. So really appreciate your time and your expertise, my friend.
Thank you, Ken.
Excellent. Thank you so much. You've been listening to AVANT Technology Insights, featuring information and opinions on how key technologies can be leveraged to solve business problems. AVANT Technology Insights is a service of AVANT Communications, a platform for IT decision-making. All opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host. For more information, Please feel free to download our research reports and other resources at www.goavant.net. That's www.goavant.net. For Avant Research and Analytics, this is Ken Presti.